Chapter 8. The Autumn of the Earthquake. One fine October day when I was still in primary school, our desks started to tremble and shake. Our classes were still mixed at that age, and all the boys and girls yelled, "Earthquake!" We ran outside as we had been taught to do. All the children gathered around our teachers as chicks swarmed to a mother hen. SWAT lies on a geological fault line and we often had earthquakes, but this felt different. All the buildings around us seemed to be shaking and the rumbling didn't stop. Most of us were crying and our teachers were praying. Miss Ruby, one of my favorite teachers, told us to stop crying and to stay calm, it would soon be over. Once the shaking had stopped, we were all sent home. We found our mother sitting in a chair holding the Quran, reciting verses over and over. Whenever there is trouble, people pray a lot. She was relieved to see us and hugged us, tears streaming down her face. But the aftershocks kept coming all afternoon, so we remained very scared. We had moved again. We would move 7 times by the time I was 13, and were living in an apartment building. It was high for Mingora, 2 stories with a big water tank on the roof. My mother was terrified it would collapse on top of us, so we kept going outside. My father did not get home till late that evening as he had been busy checking all the other school buildings. When nightfall came, there were still tremors and my mother was in a state of panic. Every time we felt a tremor, we thought it was the day of judgment. "We will be buried in our beds," she cried. She insisted we leave, but my father was exhausted and we Muslims believe our fate is written by God. So he put me and my brother's Kashal and Atal, then just a baby, to bed. "Go wherever you want," he told my mother and cousin. "I am staying here. If you believe in God, you will stay here." I think when there is a great disaster or our lives are in danger, we remember our sins and wonder how we will meet God and whether we will be forgiven. But God has also given us the power to forget, so that when the tragedy is over we carry on as normal. I trusted in my father's faith, but I also shared my mother's very real concerns. That earthquake of October 8, 2005 turned out to be one of the worst in history. It was 7.6 on the Richter scale and was felt as far away as Kabul and Delhi. Our town of Mingora was largely spared, just a few buildings collapsed, but neighboring Kashmir and the northern areas of Pakistan were devastated. Even in Islamabad, buildings collapsed. It took a while for us to realize how bad it was. When the TV news began to show the devastation, we saw that entire villages had been turned to dust. Landslides blocked access to the worst affected parts and all the phones and power lines were down. The earthquake had affected 30,000 square kilometers, an area as big as the American state of Connecticut. The numbers were unbelievable. More than 73,000 people had been killed and 128,000 injured, many of them permanently disabled. Around 3.5 million people had lost their homes. Roads, bridges, water and power had all gone. Places we had visited like Balakot were almost completely destroyed. Many of those killed were children who, like me, had been at school that morning. Some 6,400 schools were turned to rubble and 18,000 children lost their lives. We remembered how scared we had been that morning and started raising money at school. Everyone brought what they could. My father went to everybody he knew, asking for donations of food, clothing and money, and I helped my mother collect blankets. My father raised money from the SWAT Association of Private Schools and the Global Peace Council to add to what we had collected at school. The total came to more than 1 million rupees. A publishing company in Lahore which supplied our school books sent 5 trucks of food and other essentials. We were terribly worried about our family in Shangla, jammed between those narrow mountains. Finally we got news from a cousin. In my father's small village 8 people had been killed and many homes destroyed. One of them was the house of the local cleric, Maulana Khatam, which fell down crushing his 4 beautiful daughters. I wanted to go to Shangla with my father and the trucks, but he told me it would be too dangerous. When he returned a few days later, he was ashen. He told us that the last part of the journey had been very difficult. Much of the road had collapsed into the river and large boulders had fallen and blocked the way. Our family and friends said they had thought it was the end of the world. They describe the roar of rocks sliding down hills and everyone running out of their houses reciting the Quran, the screams as roofs crashed down and the howls of the buffaloes and goats. As the tremors continued, they had spent the entire day outdoors and then the night too, huddling together for warmth, even though it was bitterly cold in the mountains. To start with, the only rescue workers who came were a few from a locally based foreign aid agency and volunteers from the Tehreek Nafaz-e-Sharia-e Mohammadi, TNSM, or Movement for the Enforcement of Islamic Law, the group founded by Sufi Muhammad that had sent men to fight in Afghanistan. Sufi Muhammad had been in jail since 2002 when Musharraf arrested a number of militant leaders after American pressure, but his organization still continued and was being run by his son-in-law Maulana Fazlullah. It was hard for the authorities to reach places like Shangla because most of the roads and bridges had gone and local government had been wiped out throughout the region. We saw an official from the United Nations say on television that it was the worst logistical nightmare that the UN had ever faced. General Musharraf called it a test of the nation and announced that the army had set up Operation Lifeline. Our army likes giving their operations names. There were lots of pictures on the news of army helicopters laden with supplies and tents, but in many of the small valleys the helicopters could not land and the aid packages they dropped often rolled down slopes into rivers. In some places, when the helicopters flew and the locals all rushed underneath them, which meant they could not drop supplies safely. But some aid did get in. The Americans were quick as they had thousands of troops and hundreds of helicopters in Afghanistan, so could easily fly in supplies and show they were helping us in our hour of need, though some crews covered the American markings on their helicopters, fearing attack. For many in the remote areas it was the first time they had seen a foreigner. Most of the volunteers came from Islamic charities or organizations, but some of these were fronts for militant groups. The most visible of all was Jamaat al-Dawa, JUD, the welfare wing of Lashkar-Taiba. LET had close links to the IC and was set up to liberate Kashmir, which we believe should be part of Pakistan, not India, as its population is mostly Muslim. The leader of LET is a fiery professor from Lahore called Hafiz Saeed, who is often on television calling on people to attack India. When the earthquake happened and our government did little to help, JUD set up relief camps patrolled by men with Kalashnikovs and walkie-talkies. Everyone knew these men belonged to LET, and soon their black and white banners with crossed swords were flying everywhere in the mountains and valleys. In the town of Muzaffarabad in Azad Kashmir, the JUD even set up a large field hospital with X-ray machines, an operating theater, a well-stocked pharmacy and a dental department. Doctors and surgeons offered their services along with thousands of young volunteers. Earthquake victims praised the activists who had trudged up and down mountains and through shattered valleys carrying medical help to remote regions no one else had bothered with. They helped clear and rebuild destroyed villages as well as leading prayers and burying bodies. Even today, when most of the foreign aid agencies have gone, shattered buildings still line the roadside and people are still waiting for compensation from the government to build new houses. The JUD banners and helpers are still present. My cousin who was studying in the UK said they raised lots of money from Pakistanis living there. People later said that some of this money had been diverted to finance a plot to bomb planes traveling from Britain to the US. With such a large number of people killed, there were many children orphaned, 11,000 of them. In our culture, orphans are usually taken in by the extended family, but the earthquake was so bad that entire families had been wiped out or lost everything, so were in no position to take in children. The government promised they would all be looked after by the state, but that felt as empty as most government promises. My father heard that many of the boys were taken in by the JUD and housed in their madrassas. In Pakistan, madrassas are a kind of welfare system as they give free food and lodging, but their teaching does not follow a normal curriculum. The boys learn the Quran by heart, rocking back and forth as they recite. They learn that there is no such thing as science or literature, that dinosaurs never existed and that man never went to the moon. The whole nation was in shock for a long time after the earthquake. Already so unlucky with our politicians and military dictators, now, on top of everything else, we had to deal with a natural disaster. Mullahs from the TNSM preached that the earthquake was a warning from God. If we did not mend our ways and introduce Shariat or Islamic law, they shouted in their thundering voices, more severe punishment would come.